The handcuffs clicked shut before she could finish her coffee. Sheriff Mick Tolliver grabbed the woman by the wrist, yanked her out of the booth, and dragged her toward the door of Harlan's diner while every customer went silent. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She just looked at him with the kind of steady, unreadable calm that should have been his first warning. The kind of calm that doesn't come from innocence alone, but from knowing exactly how this ends. She was wearing green scrubs, eating scrambled eggs, and reading a manila folder. She looked like a tired nurse on a road trip. What Mick Tolliver didn't know, what nobody in Cutters Creek, Wyoming knew, was that he had just placed a federal official in restraints, and the next phone call she made was going to end his career. If you want to find out what happens next, follow this channel and stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The town of Cutters Creek sat at the bottom of a valley that the highway seemed designed to avoid. There were no tourist signs on the interstate, no welcome boards with cheerful slogans. The road into town was a two-lane strip of cracked asphalt that peeled off Route 14 like an afterthought, and most people who found themselves on it did so by accident. A wrong turn, a missed exit, or in the case of Nora Valdez, a detour around a highway accident that her GPS had calculated with no apparent awareness that it was routing her through the most isolated stretch of Wyoming she had ever seen. She had been driving since 4 in the morning. The rental car smelled like pine air freshener and stale coffee, and the heater had decided at some point around Cheyenne to blow only at half strength, leaving the interior of the vehicle in a state of determined lukewarm that was uncomfortable but not quite intolerable. Nora had stopped twice, once for gas, once to make a phone call she had been putting off, and neither stop had done anything to improve her mood. By the time the GPS announced in its flat, unconcerned voice that she had arrived at the edge of Cutters Creek, Wyoming, the sun was barely up and the valley below was gray with morning shadow. She almost kept driving. The only thing that made her pull into town was the sign for Harlan's diner, hand-painted, slightly crooked, nailed to a fence post at the intersection where the county road hit Main Street. The coffee mug painted on it was faded almost to nothing, but the steam lines above it were still bright red, which struck her as oddly cheerful, and she was cold and hungry and behind schedule in a way that adding 15 more minutes would not meaningfully change. She pulled into the gravel lot beside the diner and sat in the car for a moment with the engine running, scanning the building. Old habit, the kind of thing she had stopped doing consciously years ago, but that her body still performed automatically. Windows, exits, sight lines, the positioning of the two vehicles already in the lot. A pickup truck with a gun rack and a county sheriff's cruiser. Both belonged to someone who had been here long enough that the engines were cold. Nora picked up the manila folder from the passenger seat, tucked it under her arm, and went inside. The diner was warm in the way that only old diners managed to be. Not climate-controlled warm, but the genuine accumulated warmth of a griddle that had been running since 5 a.m. and walls that had absorbed 40 years of cooking smells. 4 tables, a counter with 8 stools, a woman behind the counter who looked to be in her 60s and moved like someone who had been working the same 8-hour shift for 20 years without complaint. 2 men in the corner booth, both wearing khaki uniforms, talking low over plates of eggs. Neither of them looked up when Nora came in. She took the table by the window, corner position, back to the wall, view of both the door and the lot. The waitress came over with a coffee pot without being asked. "Just passing through?" the woman asked. Her name tag said Bev. "Stopping for breakfast," Nora said. "Scrambled eggs and toast if you have it." "We have it." Bev poured the coffee and left without further conversation, which Nora appreciated. She opened the folder and spread 3 pages across the table, anchoring the corners with the napkin dispenser and the sugar caddy. The documents were internal assessment reports, dense, formatted in the bureaucratic shorthand of a federal office that had been generating paperwork longer than most of its current employees had been alive. She read with the focused efficiency of someone who processed this kind of material daily, making small marks in the margins with a ballpoint pen, occasionally pausing to cross-reference a number against something she carried in her head. The eggs came. She ate without looking up from the pages. She was halfway through her coffee when the chair leg scraped across from her. Nora looked up. The man sitting across the table, pulling out the chair without asking and dropping himself into it with the particular physical confidence of someone who owned every room he walked into, was one of the two men in khaki from the corner booth. He was broad, somewhere in his late 40s, with a jaw that looked like it had been installed to hold up the rest of his face. His badge caught the morning light coming through the window. Sheriff's Star, County Seal. The nameplate on his shirt read Tolliver. "Morning," he said. He was looking at the papers on the table, not at her. "Morning," Nora said. He picked up one of the pages. She put her hand on it, flat, not aggressive, just present. "Those are mine." He looked at her hand, then at her face. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. He had expected her to pull her hand back. "Passing through?" "Stopping for breakfast," she said. Same answer she had given Bev, same even tone. "What kind of medical reports are those?" "The kind that belong to me." Tolliver leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Behind the counter, Bev had gone very still. The deputy in the corner booth had stopped eating. "We don't get a lot of strangers in here reading federal documents over breakfast," the sheriff said. "I don't imagine you get many strangers at all," Nora said. "It's not exactly a destination." That landed wrong. She saw it in this tightening around his eyes. Not anger, not yet, but the precursor to it. The particular sensitivity of a man who took any observation about the limitations of his territory as a personal insult. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he said. Nora set down her fork. "Why?" "Because I'm asking." "That's not a legal basis," she said. "I'm eating breakfast. I haven't committed any crime. I haven't been involved in any incident. You sitting at my table uninvited and asking for identification without probable cause isn't a lawful request, Sheriff." The diner had gone completely quiet. Even the griddle seemed to have dialed down. Tolliver's jaw shifted. "You got a smart mouth for somebody eating alone in a county they've never set foot in before." "I get that a lot," Nora said. She picked her fork back up. He stood up. Not fast. Deliberate. Measured. The movement of a man who wanted the height advantage and knew how to use it. "Step outside with me." "No." The words sat in the air between them like something solid. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I'm not finished eating. You have no lawful reason to ask me to go anywhere, and I'd like you to return to your table." What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. Tolliver reached across and closed his hand around her wrist. Not a grab, not quite, but a grip that communicated exactly what it was intended to communicate. Nora went still. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of someone running a calculation. She looked at his hand on her wrist, then at his face. Then she slowly set her fork down a second time and stood, not because he had forced her, because she had decided something. "All right," she said, "let's go outside." The deputy, younger, mid-20s, with the look of someone who had recently realized his job was not what he expected, got up from his corner booth and followed at a distance, the way people follow when they're not sure whether they're about to be needed or whether they should have stayed where they were. In the parking lot, the morning air bit through Nora's scrubs. She stood next to the rental car with her hands at her sides and waited. "Where are you coming from?" Tolliver asked. "Cheyenne." "What's your business in this county?" "Passing through." "You said you were stopping for breakfast." "Both things can be true." He stared at her for a long moment. "You're carrying federal documents, and you won't tell me who you are or what you're doing here. You understand how that looks?" "What it looks like doesn't create probable cause," she said. "I've told you I'm passing through. I've told you the documents are mine. I haven't done anything that would legally justify this conversation, much less anything that would justify touching me." She looked pointedly at her wrist, where the mark of his grip had left a faint red band. "So I'm going to ask you one more time to let me finish my breakfast and be on my way." Tolliver looked at the deputy. Something passed between them. Not words, just a look. The kind of look that has been practiced in rooms where nobody is watching. Then he reached to his belt and unclipped the handcuffs. "Turn around." Nora didn't move. "On what charge?" "Obstruction. Suspicion of federal document theft." "That's not a real charge." "Turn around," he said again, and his voice had dropped into a register that made the deputy take a half step back. Nora turned around. She put her wrists together behind her back, and she listened to the metal click shut, and she said nothing. She was thinking. The plan she had built for this inspection tour had not included this particular detour, but she was already working through the implications, measuring what this moment could yield if she handled it correctly and what it would cost if she didn't. The deputy drove. Tolliver rode in the passenger seat and spent the 3-minute drive to the county sheriff's station without speaking. Nora sat in the back behind the cage and watched the town move past the window. Cutter's Creek was 4 blocks wide and maybe 6 blocks long. A hardware store, a pharmacy with a hand-lettered sign, a barbershop that looked like it opened twice a week at most. A community board outside the county building covered in flyers that were too far away to read. The whole town had the specific quality of a place where every person knew every other person, which should have made it safer, and in Nora's experience usually made it considerably more dangerous. The station was a flat-roofed concrete building with a parking lot that held 2 cruisers and a civilian pickup she assumed belonged to staff. Inside, a woman at the front desk looked up as they came in and immediately looked back down at whatever she had been reading, with the practiced expression of someone who had learned not to ask questions. Tolliver walked Nora past the front desk and into a holding room. Not a cell, but a room with a metal table and a metal chair and a mirror along one wall that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. He removed the handcuffs, set them on the table, and stood in the doorway. "Your folder stays at the station until we've had a chance to review it." "Those are federal documents," Nora said. "Unauthorized review of federal documents is a crime." "Sit down." "I'd like to know what I'm being charged with." "I said sit down." She sat. Not because he said so, but because she was tired and her wrist hurt and the calculation had shifted. She needed to know more about this place before she moved, and the best way to learn about a place was to let it show itself. Tolliver left. The door didn't lock, she noticed that immediately, but it didn't need to. There was one way in and one way out, and it led through the front desk and past 2 armed deputies. She sat back in the metal chair and folded her hands on the table and let the room be quiet. She thought about the reports she had been reading at the diner. They were assessment documents, the kind generated by field investigators who had spent the previous 6 months building a picture of law enforcement conduct across a 3-county region in rural Wyoming. The picture they built was not flattering: false arrest statistics, complaint records that had been altered or disappeared entirely, civil asset forfeiture numbers that were wildly inconsistent with the size and crime rate of the jurisdictions involved. The kind of numbers that, taken individually, might be explained away as clerical error or bureaucratic inefficiency. Taken together, they told a story about a pattern, deliberate, systematic, sustained over years, of abuse that the people most affected by it had no practical means of challenging. One of the 3 counties in those reports was Garrett County. The county seat was Cutter's Creek. Nora had planned to spend most of today driving the county roads and meeting with 3 individuals who had agreed to speak with an investigator on condition of anonymity. She had not planned to spend it in a holding room, but she was already revising the schedule in her head and finding that this development, inconvenient as it was, had handed her something the 6 months of field reports had not managed to produce: a first-hand demonstration of exactly how Mick Tolliver operated when he thought nobody with any power was watching. The door opened. Not Tolliver. The younger deputy. The one who had driven, who had stood behind his boss in the parking lot with that particular expression of a man caught between what he was being told to do and what he suspected was wrong. He was carrying a cup of coffee. He set it on the table in front of her without making eye contact. "Thank you," she said. He started to leave. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. "Deputy Rains." "How long have you worked here, Deputy Rains?" Another hesitation, longer this time. 2 years. She nodded, like that answered a question she hadn't actually asked. He left, and the door swung most of the way closed, but not quite all the way, which she didn't think was accidental. She drank the coffee. It was better than the diner's, which surprised her. 20 minutes passed. Then 40. She could hear voices from the front of the station, but couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of conversation, the occasional scrape of a chair. Once, a phone rang and was answered quickly. She watched the mirror on the wall and let her mind work through the timeline. By now, her vehicle was in the station lot. By now, the folder, the visible folder, the one she had been carrying, was somewhere in this building, probably in Tolliver's hands. He would look at the documents. He might understand what they were. He might not. If he was as careless as the assessment report suggested, he probably wouldn't look closely enough to recognize the specific identifiers that would tell him where those documents came from. If he was smart enough to look that closely, this morning was going to get significantly more complicated. The door opened again. Tolliver this time. He came in and stood at the end of the table, not sitting, staying on his feet the way people do when they want the physical hierarchy to mean something. He had the folder. He set it on the table between them, closed. "Where did you get these?" "They're mine," Nora said. "They're assessment reports from a federal field investigation." Yes. "Where did you get them?" She looked at him steadily. "I generated them." He blinked. Whatever answer he had been expecting, it wasn't that one. "You generated them?" "I work for the federal government. Those documents were produced by my office. I'm carrying them as part of my work." "What office?" She looked at the folder on the table, then at him, then at the mirror on the wall. "I'd like to make a phone call," she said. "We'll get to that." "Sheriff? I've been here for over an hour. I have not been formally charged. I have not been read my rights. I have not been told what I'm accused of, and you have in your possession federal documents that you have no authorization to review. I am asking, formally, for my right to make a phone call. One call. That's the law." Something crossed his face. Not guilt. She didn't think Tolliver did guilt in any functional way, but the first shadow of uncertainty. The question of whether he had made a miscalculation. He studied her for a moment, the way people study a card they've just been dealt when they're not sure if it changes the game. Then he pushed the folder across the table toward her, slid it so it stopped at her hands. "You've got 5 minutes," he said. "Rains." The young deputy appeared in the doorway. "Take her to the desk phone." Nora picked up the folder and walked out of the holding room. The front desk was a raised counter with a phone sitting on the far end, a standard landline, the old-fashioned kind with a cord. Rains stood a few feet away, close enough that the call technically wasn't private, but far enough that he had created as much distance as the room allowed. She dialed from memory. It rang twice. "Operations. Identify." "This is Director Nora Valdez," she said, keeping her voice level and even. "Badge authorization 579 Delta. I'm calling from the Garrett County Sheriff's Station in Cutters Creek, Wyoming. I have been detained without charge by Sheriff Mick Tolliver for approximately 70 minutes. I need you to log this call as an official notification of unlawful detention of a federal officer, and I need you to initiate the coordination protocol for field incident response." The pause on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Director Valdez, confirmed. Initiating now. Do you require immediate extraction?" "Not yet," she said, "but have teams standing by." "Understood. ETA to position if needed, approximately 40 minutes. "Acknowledged." She paused, glancing toward Rains. He had gone completely still, staring at her with the expression of a man who has just heard something that has reorganized everything he thought he knew about the last 2 hours. "One more thing," she said into the phone. "Flag this call for the Inspector General's office and get me Assistant Director Harmon. I'm going to need a briefing channel open." "Copying now, Director." She hung up. The station was quiet. Deputy Rains was still standing exactly where he had been, and his face had done something complicated. Not fear, not quite, but the specific expression of someone who has been walking along a road in the dark and has just felt the ground change under their feet. "Deputy," she said. He swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." "Go get your sheriff." He went. Nora set the folder on the counter and stood with her hands loose at her sides and waited. From somewhere outside, she thought she could hear, or maybe just feel, the distant throb of rotors. Still too far away to be certain, still just at the edge of perception, but getting closer. Tolliver came out of his office 30 seconds later. He walked fast, which told her Rains had said something. He came up to the counter and looked at her, and then at the phone, and something in his posture had shifted. A fraction of a degree, barely visible, the way a wall shifts before it cracks. "Who did you just call?" he asked. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said. "I told them where I was and what was happening." He set his jaw. "That's a bluff." "Is it?" "Nobody who actually worked for the federal government would let me put her in a holding room for an hour before making a call." "No," she said. "Someone who was conducting a field assessment of local law enforcement conduct in this county and wanted first-hand evidence of how that sheriff operates when he thinks he can get away with it. That person might make exactly that choice." The room had gone completely still. The woman at the front desk hadn't moved. Rains was standing in the hallway behind his boss, and the expression on the young deputy's face had resolved itself into something Nora had seen before. The look of a person who has been waiting for a moment that he didn't know he was waiting for until it arrived. Tolliver opened his mouth. Outside, clear and unmistakable now, the sound reached them all at once. Not one helicopter, 3. And beneath the rotor sound, the low diesel groan of heavy vehicles turning onto a road that hadn't seen that kind of traffic in years. The woman at the front desk stood up. Raines took a step toward the window. Tolliver turned and looked at the front door of his station as the first shadow moved across the glass. Large, moving fast, there and then gone as it banked and circled. And the sound built until it was no longer something you heard, but something you felt in your chest, in your back teeth, in the specific place where a person stores the things they have always known were coming, but tried very hard to ignore. He turned back to Nora. She looked at him across the counter of his own station, standing in her green scrubs with her manila folder, and she did not say a word. She didn't need to. Whatever Mick Tolliver had spent the last 20 years building in this valley, the authority, the fear, the particular kind of power that comes from being the only law in a place too small and too remote for anyone else to look closely, all of it had just pulled up outside his front door. The first vehicle stopped. A door opened. Boots on gravel. And Mick Tolliver, who had put handcuffs on a woman eating scrambled eggs 4 hours ago because she had looked like someone he could get away with it on, stood in the lobby of his own station and felt the floor begin to tilt. The first agent through the door was a woman in a black tactical vest with FBI stenciled across the chest in yellow letters. She was followed by 2 more in the same kit, then a 4th in a suit, older, gray at the temples, carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it had been to more federal proceedings than most judges. They moved through the front door of the Garrett County Sheriff's Station with the particular efficiency of people who had done this before and had no interest in performing it for an audience. The woman at the front desk sat back down, which was the only response available to her. Deputy Raines pressed himself against the wall of the hallway, not out of fear exactly, but out of an instinct that the space in the center of the room now belonged to someone else. Tolliver didn't move. He was still standing where Nora had last seen his face shift, that fraction of a degree tilt, the wall beginning to show the crack, and he was watching the agents come through his door with an expression that was working hard to stay controlled and not quite managing it. The man in the suit walked directly to Nora. "Director Valdez." He held out his hand. She shook it. "Harmon, you made good time. We were already staged in Casper." He glanced around the station with the neutral assessment of someone cataloging a space. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Your wrist." She looked down. The red band from his handcuffs had deepened into something that would bruise by tomorrow. "It's fine." Harmon turned to face Tolliver. He didn't cross the room, didn't approach, just turned and looked at the sheriff across the 8 feet of linoleum between them. "Sheriff Tolliver, I'm Assistant Director Paul Harmon, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need you to step away from the counter and keep your hands visible." Tolliver didn't move for 2 full seconds. Then he stepped back. "Thank you." Harmon opened the leather portfolio and removed a single document. "I have federal warrants authorizing the search of this facility, the seizure of specified records, and the temporary assumption of law enforcement authority in Garrett County pending investigation. I'm going to need the keys to your records room and your digital access credentials." "This is my station," Tolliver said. "It was," Harmon said without any particular emphasis, and turned back to Nora. "The records team is 10 minutes out. Do you want to do the briefing now or after we've secured the building?" "After," she said. "Give me the room first." Harmon nodded once and moved toward the hallway, directing the agents with a series of hand signals that sent one toward the records room, one toward the exterior, and one to take a position near the front desk. It was not dramatic. It had the quality of a process being executed by people who had executed it before, which in Nora's experience was always more unsettling to the person on the receiving end than any amount of shouting would have been. She walked past Tolliver without looking at him and retrieved the manila folder from the counter where she had left it. Then she went back to the holding room. She sat in the same metal chair she had sat in for the past 2 hours and set the folder on the table and stared at the wall for a moment. Her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. That was normal. The adrenaline that had been running beneath the surface of the last 2 hours had somewhere to go now, and it was going there, and she let it. She breathed through it the way she had been trained to breathe through things, not suppressing it, just letting the body move through the cycle without attaching too much meaning to it. She was 51 years old. She had been with the Bureau for 26 of those years. She had done field work in 4 countries and in more American cities than she could comfortably count. And she had been in situations that were objectively more dangerous than a rural sheriff's holding room, and she still felt the afterburn of it now, sitting alone, waiting for her hands to even out. She found that somewhat reassuring. The day she stopped feeling it was the day she would have to worry. She opened the folder and found the page she had been reading at the diner, found her place in the margin notes, and picked up where she had left off. Harmon knocked on the open door 11 minutes later. "Records team is in. We've got Tolliver in the conference room with a junior agent. His 2 deputies on duty are cooperating. The 3rd deputy," he checked the portfolio, "a Marcus Raines, requested to speak with the lead investigator." "That's the one who drove me here," Nora said. "Get me 10 minutes with him before you debrief Tolliver." "The sheriff's attorney is going to arrive within the hour. Tolliver made a call." "Of course he did." She closed the folder. "What was his affect when you processed him?" Harmon considered the question. "Controlled. Angry underneath, but controlled. He's done this before, but not this specifically, but the experience of being in a room with people who have authority over him. He knows how to wait." "He'll be calculating," she said. "He'll be trying to figure out what we actually have and what we're bluffing on." "We're not bluffing on anything. He doesn't know that yet." She stood. "Bring Raines to me, and get me a coffee. The deputy made some earlier, and it was decent, so wherever it came from." Harmon almost smiled. He left, and Nora stood at the mirror on the holding room wall and looked at herself for a moment. Green scrubs, smudged slightly from the gravel lot. Hair pulled back in a way that had started the day neat, and was now something more approximate. The bruise developing on her right wrist. She looked, she thought, like exactly what Tolliver had assumed she was. A tired woman passing through a place that had nothing to do with her. That was the point. That had always been the point. Marcus Raines came in 3 minutes later. He was carrying 2 mugs of coffee, which she took as a signal, and he sat down across from her without being asked, which she took as another one. He was young up close. She had clocked him as mid-20s in the diner and held that assessment now. His uniform was pressed, his badge was polished, and his hands were wrapped around the second mug in a way that suggested he needed something to hold. "Deputy," she said. "Ma'am." He paused. "Director. I'm sorry, I don't know what the right... Director is fine, or Valdez. Either works." She took a sip of the coffee. "You wanted to speak with me?" He nodded. Didn't say anything immediately. She let the silence sit where it was. "I drove you here," he said finally. "I didn't stop him. I didn't say anything." "No." "I should have." "Probably," she said. "Why didn't you?" He set the mug down and turned it in a circle on the table, a small habitual movement he probably wasn't aware of. "Because I work here. Because I've worked here for 2 years, and I know how this goes when someone argues with the sheriff." He stopped turning the mug. "I've seen it go badly. Not just arguments, actual badly. For people who couldn't..." He stopped again. "For people who couldn't afford for it to go badly," she said. "Yeah." She studied him for a moment. He wasn't performing remorse, which was the thing she'd been watching for. He was working through something that had clearly been sitting in him for some time and had just found an exit. "How long has it been like this?" "Since I started. Probably before." He looked at the wall. "I didn't think, when I took this job, I thought it was just, small-town sheriff. Wrote a lot of parking tickets and responded to noise complaints and helped old people when their cars broke down. That's what they told me at the academy. Rural posting, community policing." He shook his head, very slightly, like he was disagreeing with his own younger self. "First week, I watched Tolliver pull over a family. Just a family in a minivan, out of state plates. And he just took money out of the husband's wallet. Not a fine, not a ticket, just took it. Said it was seized for suspected criminal activity and wrote nothing down, and I was standing right there." "What did you do?" "Nothing." The word landed flat, and he didn't try to dress it up. "I went home and I sat in my truck in the driveway for about 45 minutes, and then I went inside." Nora said nothing. "That was 2 years ago," Raines said. "It's not every week, it's not constant, but it's enough. Enough that you start to feel like you're made out of it, like you're part of it just by being here. He picked up the mug again. When you made that call, at the desk, and I heard what you said, I didn't know whether to feel relieved or sick to my stomach. I still don't. You can feel both, she said. They're not mutually exclusive. She folded her hands on the table. I need to ask you some questions. Formal interview, recorded. You'll need to decide in the next few minutes whether you're willing to cooperate with a federal investigation. I'm not going to promise you anything about outcomes. That's not my department, and I wouldn't insult you by pretending it is. But I can tell you that cooperation is the factor that matters most in how the next several months look for everyone who works in this building. He didn't hesitate the way she expected. Okay, he said. Yeah, okay. You have the right to an attorney present. I know. He straightened slightly in the chair. I don't need one. I haven't done anything that I'd need to hide from an attorney. She believed him, and she had spent enough years in rooms like this one with people who were lying and people who weren't, that she trusted the distinction her instincts drew. All right, she said, let's start with the asset forfeiture records. What came out of the next hour and 40 minutes was not surprising in its content. She had read versions of it in the field reports, had mapped the shape of it from the numbers, but it was still difficult to sit through. Raines knew where the physical records were kept because he had filed some of them. He knew which cases had been closed without formal charge because he had watched Tolliver close them. He knew the names of 3 residents who had filed complaints that had subsequently vanished from the system, and he knew those names because 2 of them had come to him personally, quietly, in the parking lot of the county pharmacy, and told him what had happened, and he had written down nothing and done nothing and carried it. That was the part that cost him something to say out loud. She could see it cost him. She didn't make it easier by softening what it was. When the recording was paused, she stood and stretched and looked at the corner of the ceiling for a moment. You gave me names, she said. Those people took a risk talking to you, even informally. When this goes further, and it will go further, they're going to need to know what cooperation looks like and what it gets them. Will they be protected? That's not a simple yes or no answer. What I can tell you is that we have people whose entire job is making sure witness cooperation doesn't cost cooperating witnesses more than it costs the people they're testifying against. Those people are good at their jobs. She looked at him. That's the most honest answer I can give you. He nodded. It wasn't satisfaction exactly, but it was the acceptance of a realistic answer by someone who had been lied to enough times to recognize the difference. The attorney arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Nora was briefed by Harmon in the records room while the attorney conferred with Tolliver in the conference room, and what Harmon laid out across the folding table, physical files, printed logs, 2 hard drives pulled from a desktop computer that turned out not to have been wiped, was considerably more than the field reports had suggested they would find. The asset forfeiture records alone covered 6 years. The dollar amounts ran into the low hundreds of thousands across approximately 300 individual incidents. Not enormous sums when looked at in aggregate, but what they represented in individual human terms was a different calculation entirely. Families who had lost grocery money. People whose cars had been impounded and never returned. A woman who had lost the security deposit she had saved for an apartment and ended up sleeping in her mother's basement for 8 months. The money had moved into a county account, and then out of that account through a series of transfers that would take a forensic accounting team weeks to untangle, but the direction it moved was already legible in the rough shape of the numbers. There's more, Harmon said. He opened a physical folder, older, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, and pushed it across to her. This predates the digital records by about 4 years. Someone kept paper backups. She looked at the top sheet. This was in his office? Bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, under a hanging file labeled Archived Vehicle Inspections. She read the first 2 pages without speaking. When she looked up, her face was still neutral, but something had shifted behind her eyes. Get me a direct line to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cheyenne, she said. This afternoon. Already requested. She looked back at the file. He's been doing this for 11 years, Paul. Harmon said nothing. There wasn't anything to say. In the conference room down the hall, Tolliver was doing what Nora had predicted. Calculating. She could hear his attorney's voice, low and measured, walking through the standard framework. Say nothing, admit nothing, challenge the warrant, buy time. It was a reasonable strategy if you had committed a reasonable crime. She had seen it work. She had also seen it fail catastrophically when the person employing it didn't know what evidence already existed, and Mick Tolliver, sitting in his own conference room while federal agents documented 11 years of systematic abuse in his own records room, did not know what they had. He had handed them the keys to his own building, his own computers, his own files, because he had been too confident for too long to think clearly about what any of it contained. That was the thing about people who had operated without consequences for a long time. They forgot that consequences existed. Not abstractly, they knew in a theoretical way that crimes could be investigated and documented and charged. But they stopped being able to feel the reality of it. The reality had been so long absent that it had become merely a concept, and concepts weren't frightening. Reality had shown up today. Nora left Harmon with the records team and walked out of the station through the back door into the parking lot. The afternoon had moved past its midpoint, and the valley that held Cutter's Creek was in that specific late-day light that made even a concrete parking lot look temporarily significant. 3 FBI vehicles were positioned around the perimeter. An agent she didn't recognize was speaking on a phone near the rear vehicle. The helicopters were down somewhere. She could hear their engines cooling, a faint ticking she couldn't source precisely. She walked to her rental car, which had been moved into the lot by someone at some point during the afternoon. She opened the passenger door and took the secondary folder from the glove compartment, the one she hadn't been carrying at the diner, the one that didn't appear in any inventory Tolliver had seen. She opened it and found the page she needed. 3 names, 3 people in Garrett County who had agreed to speak with a federal investigator. She had been scheduled to meet them this afternoon. She pulled out her phone and dialed the first number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She left a brief message, her name, a callback number, a request for a meeting tomorrow morning if possible. The second number was answered on the second ring by a woman who said, "Hello?" with the particular caution of someone who had been expecting a call. They weren't certain they wanted to receive. "This is Nora Valdez," she said. "We spoke through an intermediary about 6 weeks ago. I want you to know that I'm in Cutter's Creek, and what we discussed is moving forward." Silence. Then, "You're here? In town?" "At the county sheriff's station, yes." More silence. "Is Tolliver? He's not going anywhere today?" Nora said. A sound came through the phone that was not quite a word. Something between breath and syllable, the kind of sound a person makes when something they have been holding very carefully for a very long time is suddenly allowed to put a little of its weight down. "I've been waiting 2 years, the woman said. "I filed a report and it disappeared. And I went back and they said there was no record of it." "I know," Nora said. "I have records showing it was filed. We're going to need to talk about that. Is it safe to come in? To the station? We have full federal control of the facility right now. Yes." Another pause. "Tonight?" "Tonight is fine," Nora said. "Come to the front entrance and ask for Agent Harmon." She ended the call and stood in the parking lot looking at the surrounding hills, which were brown and dry at the end of summer, the grass beaten flat by weeks without rain. A hawk was working a thermal somewhere above the eastern ridge, barely moving, riding the updraft with the patience of something that had no schedule. She watched it for a moment, then went back inside. The first real complication arrived at 4:17. One of the agents from the records team knocked on the door of the holding room, where Nora had returned to work through documents. He was young, careful in the way new agents learn to be careful when carrying information to someone above their pay grade. He set a printed page on the table in front of her. "This came off the hard drive," he said. "The IT forensics team pulled it from a deleted folder. It was wiped, but not thoroughly." She looked at the page. It was a copy of a communication, not an email, a scanned physical letter, and the letterhead at the top made her go still. The letterhead belonged to the Garrett County Commission. Below it, dated 14 months ago, was a letter addressed to Sheriff Mick Tolliver from the county commissioner, a man named Gerald Foss. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph thanked Tolliver for his continued cooperation. The second paragraph referenced, obliquely and in language designed to obscure, a series of fund transfers. The third paragraph contained a single line that was considerably less oblique. "The arrangement discussed in March continues to have full commission support, and your discretion in these matters remains appreciated." Nora set the page down. "How many people have seen this?" she asked. "Just the IT team and me," the agent said. "I came straight here." "Good. I need this treated as a separate evidence thread from the forfeiture records. Separate chain of custody, separate documentation. Don't discuss it with anyone on the team who wasn't in that room. Yes, ma'am. And get me a background pull on Gerald Foss. Everything public record in the last 5 years. Right away. He left. Nora sat with the printed page for a long moment. This was the thing that field reports couldn't quite capture. The thing that the numbers and the complaint records and the forfeiture logs all hinted at, but never made fully explicit. The way these arrangements almost never stayed contained to one person. Tolliver hadn't built this alone. He had operated in a structure that permitted it, and structures that permitted things like this almost always had other architects. The letter from Foss was one data point, but one data point in a case like this was rarely one data point. It was the corner of something larger, and the question of how large and how far back and how many people had known and chosen not to see was now the question that superseded everything else. Which meant this case, which had been scoped as a 3-county law enforcement misconduct investigation, had just grown. She thought about that, about the additional resources it would require, about the timeline which had just expanded, about the people in this town who had spent years absorbing the weight of a system that was more comprehensively corrupt than even the field reports had indicated, and who would now have to wait longer to see the end of it. She looked at the names on the second page of her folder. The 3 people who had agreed to talk. One of them was coming tonight. She picked up her pen and wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. Commissioner. She underlined it. Then she turned to the next document and kept reading, and the afternoon light moved across the floor of the holding room and reached the wall and began to climb, the way afternoon light does when it is running out of floor. At 5:40, Harmon came back. He didn't knock this time, which meant he had something he didn't want to frame as a formal delivery. He sat down across from her, same chair Deputy Raines had used, and set his hands flat on the table. Tolliver's attorney has requested that we produce the specific warrant language covering the digital records by end of business, he said. It's a delay tactic, but it's a valid procedural request. Fine, produce it. It's not the warrant I'm worried about. He paused. The attorney made a comment to one of our junior agents in passing that was clearly intended to be overheard. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that Sheriff Tolliver has relationships with several individuals at the federal district level, and that those relationships have historically been useful in matters of this kind. Nora looked at him. He said that to a junior agent. On his way out of the conference room, loud enough for 2 people to hear. That's not a threat, she said. That's a test. He wanted to see how it landed, whether anyone flinched. Did anyone flinch? Did you flinch? Harmon's expression didn't change. No. Then we're fine. She closed the folder on the table. But I want that comment logged. The agent who heard it, the exact time, the exact words as close as they can recall. I want it in the incident record tonight. Done. He didn't move. She could tell there was something else. What? The woman coming in tonight, he said. We ran a preliminary background to prepare for the interview. Her name is Darlene Okafor. 53. She ran a small business in town, a cleaning service, 6 employees. Filed a complaint against Tolliver's department 18 months ago alleging wrongful seizure of her business vehicle, which was apparently her only company van. He paused. 3 months after the complaint disappeared from the system, her business license was revoked on a technicality by the county permitting office. She closed the business 8 months ago. She's been working at the grocery in town since then. Nora sat very still. She lost 6 jobs when she closed, Harmon continued. Her 6 employees. 2 of them are still unemployed. And the van? Never returned. No record of it in the impound log. Nora stood up and walked to the window of the holding room, which was a narrow horizontal slit near the ceiling that showed a strip of sky going orange at its lower edge. She looked at it. She thought about a woman who had run a business, employed 6 people, filed a complaint, watched the complaint vanish, and then watched her livelihood get dismantled by a system that knew she had dared to push back. She's coming in tonight, Nora said. 8 o'clock. She confirmed an hour ago. Nora turned around. Make sure the front of the station looks like what it is right now. Federal. I don't want her walking in and seeing anything that reminds her of the last time she was in a room with people wearing that county badge. Harmon stood. Already arranged. He left for the second time, and Nora sat back down, and the strip of sky in the window went from orange to the specific deep blue that arrives in the last 20 minutes before dark, and she opened the folder again. She was still reading when the knock came at the door. Not Harmon, not Raines, not any of the agents. The woman at the front desk, the one who had kept her head down since the moment the federal agents walked in, who had said nothing to anyone for the past 7 hours, who had pressed herself so thoroughly into the background of the room that Nora had nearly forgotten she existed. She was standing in the doorway with her coat on, her bag on her shoulder, the posture of someone who had clocked out and was about to leave and had made a decision at the last second. She looked at Nora across the small room, and she didn't apologize for the interruption, and she didn't ask permission. "I want to tell you something," the woman said. Nora set the pen down. "I've worked the front desk here for 9 years. Her voice was steady, but she was gripping the strap of her bag hard enough that the knuckles had blanched. "I've seen every person who's come through that door. Every arrest. Every complaint. Every time someone walked in thinking they'd get help and walked out with nothing." She stopped, started again. "I wrote things down, in a notebook. Dates, names, what I saw. Not official, just, I didn't know what else to do with it. I just couldn't." She shook her head. "I have the notebook at home. I've had it for 9 years. I want to give it to you." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "What's your name?" she asked. "Patricia Sundell," the woman said. "Ms. Sundell, can you bring the notebook here tomorrow morning?" Patricia Sundell nodded. Her grip on the bag strap didn't loosen. "I thought about burning it," she said. "A lot of times, because if he found it—" She stopped again, and whatever she was going to say stayed in her, but it didn't need to be said. The shape of it was clear enough. 9 years, Nora said. "You kept it for 9 years." "Someone had to write it down," Patricia said. "Someone had to remember." She left. Her footsteps crossed the front desk, and the main door opened and closed, and the station settled back into the hum of fluorescent lights and quiet federal efficiency. Nora sat in the holding room and looked at the empty doorway, and then she looked at her hands, which were steady now. Tomorrow was going to be longer than today. And somewhere in the county building 3 blocks away, in an office she hadn't visited yet, a man named Gerald Foss was going about his evening with no idea that his letter, the one he had written 14 months ago on official letterhead, the one he had probably convinced himself was safe because it was careful, and because Mick Tolliver was careful, and because nothing in Garrett County had ever come apart before, was sitting in a plastic evidence sleeve on the table in front of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The door to the conference room at the far end of the hall opened. She heard the attorney's voice, professionally modulated. Heard Tolliver's voice, lower, saying something she couldn't make out. Heard the conference room door close again. Then, in the quiet that followed, she heard something else. Something that took her a moment to identify because it was so out of place in the controlled atmosphere of a federal operation. It was a second phone, not ringing from inside the station, coming from outside through the narrow window above her head, from somewhere in the parking lot. A number she didn't recognize on a device she hadn't issued. She was on her feet and at the door before she'd fully processed the decision. She went through the back door at a controlled walk, not a run, because running through a federal crime scene without context created problems, and she needed to see the context before she created problems. The parking lot was lit by 2 portable flood lamps the agents had set up on the east and west ends, and the light was the flat white kind that turned everything slightly colorless. 3 agents were visible, 1 near the roadside perimeter, 1 at the vehicle line, 1 on his phone near the second SUV. None of them were behaving unusually. None of them were looking at anything that suggested they'd heard what she'd heard. She stopped at the corner of the building and listened. Nothing now. Silence from the lot, the faint hiss of wind off the ridge, the cooling tick of one of the SUV engines. Whatever she had heard through the window, a phone, she was sure it had been a phone, and not any of the standard issue devices she had authorized for this operation, was not ringing anymore. She stood there for 30 seconds. The agent near the vehicle line noticed her and straightened. "Director, everything okay?" "Did anyone come through the lot in the last 5 minutes?" He thought about it. A truck slowed on the road. Didn't stop. Kept going. "What kind of truck?" "Dark color. Couldn't tell the make in the dark. Had county plates. I noticed because I was logging vehicles." She looked at the road. It ran straight east from the station parking lot, and disappeared into the dark where the streetlights ran out. Get me the partial on those plates if you logged them. I've got the first 3 characters. Give them to Harmon. Tell him I want a county vehicle registry cross-referenced against those characters tonight. She turned back toward the building. And log the truck in the incident record. Time, direction, everything you have. Yes, ma'am. She went back inside. The thing about a phone ringing in a parking lot adjacent to a federal operation was that it was probably nothing. It was probably someone's personal cell, a civilian driving past, a deputy who lived in the county and had driven by out of curiosity about what was happening at his station. Probably. But Garrett County's law enforcement apparatus had just been placed under federal seizure, and the man who had run that apparatus for 11 years was sitting 40 feet down the hall with an attorney, and Gerald Foss was somewhere in this town, and the letter in the evidence sleeve was 14 months old, which meant whatever arrangement it described was 14 months old at minimum, and arrangements that old, in departments this size, in counties this isolated, almost always had more participants than the ones whose names appeared in the documents. She went to find Harmon. He was in the records room, standing over a folding table with 2 agents and a laptop, working through a log that stretched across 3 printed pages. He looked up when she came in. She told him about the phone, about the truck, about the county plates. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she appreciated most about him. I'll run it, he said. You think someone made contact with Tolliver? I think someone drove past his station at night during a federal operation, and that's worth knowing about. She looked at the laptop. Where are we on the Foss background? Preliminary pull is done. He slid a printed page across the table. Gerald Foss, 61. County Commissioner for 14 years. No criminal record. 1 civil dispute in 2019. Property boundary issue. Settled out of court. Married. 2 adult children. Lives about 4 miles outside of town. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. His financial disclosures for the last 3 years show income consistent with the commissioner's salary and some rental property. But the rental property income it's high. Higher than what you'd expect from 2 residential units in a rural Wyoming county. How high? Enough that a forensic accountant is going to have questions. She set the page back down. Get the forensic team flagged on Foss first thing tomorrow, and I want someone physically at his office when it opens in the morning. Not arresting, not confronting, just present. I want him to know we know he exists. Harmon nodded. He started to say something else, and then the door to the records room opened and Marcus Raines stepped in, and both of them looked at him. He looked at Nora. Darlene Okafor is here, he said. She's early. It was 20 minutes past 7. Nora took a breath and reset the part of her mind that had been running the Foss calculation. Put her in the conference room, not the holding room, the conference room. Get her water, coffee, if she wants it. Tell her I'll be there in 5 minutes. Raines nodded and left. She did it in 4. Darlene Okafor was a compact woman with natural hair going gray at the edges and the careful, self-contained posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in rooms that hadn't always been kind to her. She was wearing a green canvas jacket over a uniform shirt in embroidered letters on the chest pocket. She had a paper cup of water in front of her that she hadn't touched. She looked at Nora when she came in, looked at the scrubs, the bruised wrist, the practical ponytail, and something in her expression shifted, not what she'd expected, whatever that was. Director Valdez, Nora said, sitting across from her. Thank you for coming in. Darlene looked at the door, then back. You said it was safe. It is. The sheriff has no authority in this facility tonight. He's not going anywhere. She folded her hands on the table. I want to hear what happened. In your own words, at your own pace. But I want to start by telling you something first. She waited until Darlene met her eyes. I've read the field report on your case. I know what was filed and when it disappeared. I know what happened to your business license. What I'm telling you is that those things are documented and they matter, and you are not starting from nothing. Darlene looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite tears, but the pressure of something that had been stored in a place where it couldn't move and was now being given a small amount of space to expand. The van was paid off, Darlene said. Took me 4 years. It was a 2017 Transit. I wrapped it, had the company name put on the side, professional, like a real operation. She stopped, swallowed. He took it on a Tuesday in February. Deputy came to my house, said it was being seized. Wouldn't show me a warrant, told me if I argued I'd be arrested for obstruction. Did you get a receipt for the seizure? No. Any paperwork at all? Nothing. I went to the station 3 days later and Tolliver told me the vehicle had been seized in connection with a drug investigation. Said it might be released when the investigation concluded. She shook her head. There was no drug investigation. He made that up. My van had never been near anything illegal in its life. When you filed the complaint, I filed it with the county. And when that went nowhere, I tried to file with the state police. They said it was a county matter and referred me back. She picked up the paper cup, looked at it, set it back down. I hired a lawyer with money I didn't have. He sent 2 letters to the county. Got no response. When I went back to the station, Tolliver told me. He looked right at me and said, she paused again, organized herself. He said, some people in this county understand how things work here, and some people don't. The ones who don't tend to have a harder time of it. The room was very quiet. 3 months later, my business license was flagged for a fire code violation on a vehicle I no longer had. They revoked it in 48 hours. Didn't give me time to contest it. She set her hands flat on the table, mirroring Nora's posture without seeming to realize it. I had 6 employees. 2 of them had worked with me for 5 years. I had to call them on a Thursday afternoon and tell them there was no business anymore. Nora didn't say anything immediately. She let the statement exist in the room without rushing to fill the space around it. I want you to know, Nora said finally, that what you're describing is going to be part of a federal case. Your complaint, the seizure, the license revocation, the intimidation, all of it. And I want you to understand that means giving a formal statement, potentially testifying, and doing that in a way that's going to require your name to be on record. Darlene looked at her steadily. I know. It's not a small thing. I know that too. She picked up the water cup and this time drank from it. I've been quiet for a year and a half. I've been ringing up groceries and smiling at people who still bring their cars to the county lot for inspection, and I watch them go in and come out and I think about... She stopped. I'm not interested in being quiet anymore. Nora held her gaze. Then let's talk. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. By the time Darlene Okafor left the station, walking out through the front door past 2 FBI agents, past the federal seizure notice posted beside the county badge on the wall, out into a night that was exactly the same temperature it had been when she arrived, but felt, she said, like it was something different. Nora had 3 pages of handwritten notes and had arranged for a formal recorded interview the following morning. She was standing at the front desk reviewing those notes when the call came. Her personal cell, not the operations line. The number was from a Wyoming area code she didn't recognize, and she answered it with the automatic wariness of someone who answered unfamiliar numbers differently in the middle of a federal operation than she did in ordinary life. Valdez, she said. A pause. Then a man's voice, even and low and not quite as controlled as it wanted to be. I know who you are. She didn't respond. I think we should have a conversation, the voice said. A private one. Before this gets further than it needs to go. Who am I speaking with? Another pause, longer this time. She could hear the calculation in it. The man on the other end deciding how much to commit to. Someone who has information that would be relevant to your investigation. Information you don't have yet. And who has an interest in making sure that information comes to you in a context that's managed. Managed, she repeated. The way these things should be managed when everyone involved is a professional. She had heard versions of this conversation before. The offer of cooperation framed as mutual benefit. The implication that there was a version of the outcome that could be shaped, that the person calling had something to trade and was reaching out before the window for trading closed. The difference between the ones who called from a position of genuine leverage and the ones who called from desperation was usually audible within the first 30 seconds. And this one was a man who was frightened but was controlling it, which meant he was either very experienced or very smart, and either way he was not a small piece of whatever this was. Tell me your name, she said. In person, he said. Tonight, if that works. It doesn't. Tomorrow then, early. Before... He stopped himself. Before the day gets complicated. She looked at the front door of the station, at the night beyond the glass. If you have information material to a federal investigation, the correct process is to contact the FBI field office in Cheyenne and request a formal interview. An attorney is strongly advised. I know the correct process, he said, and for the first time something slightly less composed came through. I'm trying to avoid the part where the correct process puts me in the same room as Mick Tolliver. That was interesting. She kept her voice neutral. Are you concerned about your personal safety in connection with this investigation? I'm concerned about a number of things. One of them is what happens when someone who has spent 11 years building a set of arrangements realizes those arrangements are coming apart. 11 years. The same number she had said to Harmon in the records room, which had not been publicly stated anywhere. She filed that. Call the Cheyenne field office, she said. Tell them Director Valdez authorized the contact. They'll arrange a secure interview. And if I need it to be faster than that, then you're going to tell me your name right now. The silence this time was different from the previous ones. It had a quality of decision rather than calculation. Harwick, the man said. Neil Harwick. I'm a county attorney. I've been with Garrett County for 7 years. She wrote it on the corner of her notepad. Mr. Harwick, call Cheyenne in the morning. Ask for the duty agent and give them my authorization. They'll take it from there. She ended the call. She stood at the front desk for a moment, looking at the name she had written. County Attorney, 7 years. The letter from Foss had been drafted and presumably reviewed by someone in the county legal office before it went out. That was standard practice, the kind of professional habit that survived even in corrupt administrations. Because the people running those administrations still wanted the appearance of procedural correctness. A county attorney who had been present for 7 years would have seen things, would have been asked to review things, would have, at various points, made choices. I was calling because he had made choices he wanted to distance himself from before someone else told the story of those choices first. That was useful. That was, in fact, potentially very useful. She went to find Harmon again. It was past 10 by the time the station settled into the quieter rhythm of a long-haul operation. Agents rotating through shifts, documents being logged. The conference room where Tolliver had met with his attorney, now serving as a secondary processing space. Nora ate half a sandwich from a box someone had brought in from somewhere, standing at the records room table, reading through the financial cross-reference Harmon had pulled together on Foss. The rental property income was the thread she kept returning to. 2 residential units generating numbers that didn't fit their assessed value, in a county where property values were modest and consistent. The discrepancy wasn't enormous in absolute terms. It was the kind of thing that passed unremarked in a yearly disclosure filing, the kind of thing that required a specific reason to look at before it became visible as a problem. But looked at in the context of the forfeiture records, in the context of the Tolliver letter, in the context of Neil Harwick calling from an unregistered number at 9:45 on the night a federal operation descended on his county, it acquired a different quality. She was still reading when the alarm went. Not an alarm in the station. The sound was from outside, distant, from the direction of the main road. One of the perimeter agents came through the back door at a controlled jog. Vehicle incident on Route 9, he said, half-mile west. Looks like a single car. Route 9 was the road that led out of Cutter's Creek toward the county building, toward the residential areas, toward the address she had noted in the Foss background file. Who's on Perimeter West, she asked. Agents DeLuca and Park. Get them to the scene, and I want to know whose vehicle it is before anything else. He went. Harmon appeared in the doorway of the records room with his coat on. He had heard. I'm going, he said. It was not a question. Take 2 agents, Radio Channel 4. He left. She stayed because her job right now was here, in this building, with these documents, with the 11 years of evidence that was slowly being assembled into a picture that had to be airtight before it went anywhere near a federal courtroom. She stayed and she read and she listened to the radio chatter that began coming through the device on Harmon's empty chair 6 minutes later. The first transmission was flat and procedural, single vehicle, off the east shoulder of Route 9, front end into a drainage ditch, engine off, no fire. The second transmission was different. Director Valdez, Harmon's voice, the careful tone he used when he was managing what he conveyed and how. We have an injured individual, male, conscious, identification confirmed. You're going to want to know this. Tell me. A brief pause. The sound of wind through the radio. It's Gerald Foss. She set the sandwich down. He's alive, Harmon continued. Ambulance is en route. He's got a head laceration and what looks like a broken wrist from the wheel. He's talking. Valdez, he's asking for you specifically. He's saying your name. She was already reaching for her coat. What's his condition? Conscious, oriented, agitated. I keep saying he needs to speak with you before... A pause while someone said something she couldn't make out. Before anyone else gets there. Those are his words. Keep him talking. Don't let him say anything substantive until I'm there. It needs to be on record. Get the ambulance to hold on transport if you can without compromising his medical status. Understood. She moved through the station fast. Rains was at the front desk. He had stayed, apparently, on his own initiative for a shift that had ended 3 hours ago. And he stood up when he saw her moving. "Deputy," she said without slowing, "you're with me." He grabbed his jacket off the back of his chair and followed her out. The night was cold in the serious way of Wyoming at elevation, the kind of cold that arrived after dark with no transition period and no apology. The rental car was where she had left it, and she was in the driver's seat and moving before Rains had fully closed the passenger door. "You know this county," she said. "Route 9 West, drainage ditch on the east shoulder. What's out there?" "Mostly residential, some farmland." He thought for a second. "Foss lives out that way, maybe 2-3 miles past where..." "I know." He looked at her. "You think it wasn't an accident?" She didn't answer immediately because she was thinking about a phone ringing in the parking lot and a truck with county plates and a county attorney calling from an unregistered number to tell her that a man who had spent 11 years building arrangements was the kind of man who became unpredictable when those arrangements came apart. "I think," she said carefully, "that a county official who is materially connected to an active federal investigation was driving on a rural road at 10:30 at night and went into a ditch, and that his first request upon regaining consciousness was to speak with me specifically, and that those facts exist together and need to be understood together." Rains was quiet for a moment. "You think Tolliver had something to do with it?" "Tolliver has been in that station all day. He has a phone." She didn't say anything to that because it was true, and he knew it was true, and neither of them needed to finish the sentence. The scene came into view as she rounded the long curve on Route 9. 2 FBI vehicles angled on the shoulder, Harmon's flashlight moving near the ditch, an ambulance just pulling up from the opposite direction, its light strobing red and white across the flat gray asphalt. She pulled in behind the Bureau vehicles and got out. The car was a dark blue sedan, county registered, front right quarter panel crumpled against the concrete lip of the drainage channel. It had gone in at an angle, which suggested the driver had tried to correct before impact, the kind of trajectory you got from a swerve, not a drift. Swerves meant something had happened suddenly. A deer, a blown tire, a vehicle coming at you in the dark, or something else. Foss was sitting on the shoulder 10 feet from the car, an agent's emergency blanket around his shoulders, a compress held to the left side of his head by his own shaking hand. He was a large man, broad in the way of someone who had been athletic once and had softened into it over time. His face was pale, and his eyes were tracking, and when he saw Nora walking toward him, he tried to stand up. "Don't," she said, and he stopped. She crouched in front of him. The laceration was bad, scalp wounds bled hard regardless of severity, and the compress was soaked, but the bleeding had slowed. His left wrist was held against his chest, and his face tightened every time the arm moved. She checked his eyes without touching him, both pupils responsive to the flashlight she tilted, no obvious asymmetry. "Mr. Foss," she said, "I'm Director Valdez. You asked for me." His mouth worked for a second. "Someone ran me off the road," he said. "A truck. No plates on the front. I noticed because I was looking, I was watching, I knew..." He stopped. His breathing was ragged but controlled. "I knew after I heard what was happening at the station. I knew it wasn't going to stay. Contained." "Who ran you off the road?" "I don't know the driver. I know the truck. It belongs to..." He stopped again. His good hand came up and gripped the edge of the emergency blanket. "It belongs to a man named Pritchard, Dale Pritchard. He does work for Tolliver, has for years, off the books." Nora looked up at Harmon, who was standing 2 steps behind her. He was already on his radio. "Mr. Foss." She kept her voice even, deliberate, the kind of voice you used with someone in shock who needed to stay tethered to the present. "I need you to understand your legal situation right now. You are a person of interest in a federal investigation. Anything you say can and will be part of that record. You have the right to an attorney. Do you understand?" "I understand." He met her eyes. I don't want an attorney. I want to tell you what I know before. He looked at the road, then back at her. Before someone decides I know too much. Was coming down the shoulder with a gurney. She held up a hand to slow them. 30 seconds, she signaled, and they stopped. Then you have 30 seconds, she said to Foss. Give me the most important thing you know. He didn't hesitate. The money from the forfeiture accounts, he said. Tolliver kept maybe 30%. The rest went to 3 people. I'm one of them. The other 2, one is a state-level official. Not county. State. He swallowed, and his face contracted with the effort of it. He's been covering the investigation into this county for 2 years. Every time your people got close, he redirected resources, buried reports. The field investigation that landed here. He tried to kill it twice before it got to you. The ambulance crew reached them, and Nora stood and stepped aside. Her heart rate was exactly what it should have been, and her hands were exactly what they should have been, but something behind her eyes had gone very still, the way things go still, when the architecture of a case reorganizes itself around a piece of information that changes the scale of everything. A state-level official. Someone with the reach to redirect federal investigative resources. Someone who had been watching this particular investigation and had tried to stop it from reaching a conclusion, twice, before it landed in her hands. Which meant someone had known she was coming before she arrived. Which meant the detour, the diner, the arrest. Any of it could have been seen in advance by the right person in the right position. She looked at Harmon over the ambulance crew's shoulders. He looked back at her. He had heard. His face had done the same thing hers had done, and they had worked together long enough that she didn't need to say what the expression meant. Get Foss secured and transported, she said. I want an agent with him at the hospital, in the room, not in the hallway. And get the medical team's assessment logged the moment they have one. Done. And Paul. He stopped. She kept her voice low enough that it didn't carry past the 2 of them. Who knew the schedule for this inspection tour? Who had access to the routing before I left Cheyenne? He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. The operations office, he said. My assistant. The transport coordinator. He paused. And the Wyoming district liaison. She looked at him. The liaison's name, she said. He said it. She turned and walked back to the rental car and stood with her hand on the roof, looking at the dark road ahead, and the lights of Cutter's Creek behind her, and the hills beyond the valley that were invisible in the dark except for the absence of stars where their ridgelines cut the sky. Someone in the structure of her own operation had known she was coming, and if they had known she was coming, they had known where she would stop. And if they had known where she would stop, then the man who had put handcuffs on her at a diner on a Tuesday morning might not have acted entirely on his own. She stood at the roof of the rental car for 11 seconds. She counted them without meaning to, the way the mind imposes structure on moments when the ground has just shifted and the body needs something to do while the brain catches up. Then she got in the car and drove back to the station. Raines rode in the passenger seat without speaking, which she appreciated. He had heard enough of what Foss said to understand that the shape of the case had changed, and he was smart enough to know that the space between that understanding and whatever came next belonged to her, not to him. He looked out the window and let her think. The Wyoming district liaison's name was Carl Weber. She had worked with him twice in the previous 3 years, once on a cross-jurisdictional fraud case that had originated in Laramie, once on a personnel matter that had been sensitive enough to handle through the liaison office rather than direct channels. He was efficient, communicative, and had the particular institutional loyalty of a man who had built his career through consistent reliability rather than brilliance. He was not someone she had ever had a reason to doubt. She was thinking about reasons now. The inspection tour routing had been finalized 8 days ago. The schedule had been distributed through the operations office on a need-to-know basis, which in practice meant the operations coordinator, Harmon's assistant, the transport coordinator who had arranged the rental vehicles, and the Wyoming district liaison who handled field coordination for the region. Standard protocol. The kind of distribution that was tight enough to feel secure and wide enough, in retrospect, to contain a problem. She thought about the truck with county plates in the parking lot, the unregistered number Neil Harwick had called from. Gerald Foss going into a drainage ditch on a road he drove every day. The specific sequence of it, not random, not reactive, but paced, like someone managing a situation that was escalating faster than they had expected. Someone had known she was coming to Garrett County. If that someone was Carl Weber, then the question of what he had communicated, to whom, and how far in advance, was the question that reorganized everything else. Because if Weber had told Tolliver that a federal director was routing through Garrett County on an inspection tour, then Tolliver's behavior at the diner was not the impulsive arrogance of a man who had been unchallenged for too long. It was something else, something more deliberate and more difficult. She pulled into the station lot and cut the engine. "Rains," she said. "Yeah." "When Tolliver arrested me this morning, what was his mood before I came into the diner?" The deputy thought about it. "Normal, same as always. We'd been there maybe 20 minutes. He had his eggs. He was talking about a property complaint on the east side of the county, some fence dispute." "Was he on his phone before I came in?" Another pause. Longer. "He stepped out to the lot when we first arrived. I thought he was checking on something with the cruiser. He was maybe 5 minutes. Before you went inside?" "Yeah." She looked at the station. "Did he seem like he was looking for something when he came back in?" Rains turned in the seat to face her more directly. She could see him reconstructing the morning from a different angle, applying a lens he hadn't been using when it happened. "He came back in and he looked around the diner," he said slowly. "I thought he was just, checking who was there. He always does that. But then he looked at your table and he kind of settled, like he'd found what he was looking for." She nodded once, got out of the car. Inside, she went directly to the conference room where Tolliver had been all day. The junior agent posted outside straightened when she approached. "Has he made any calls in the last 2 hours?" 2 calls through his attorney, both logged. His attorney's cell to Tolliver's attorney's office. Both were case-related from what we could establish. His personal phone? In evidence intake since this afternoon, he hasn't had access. His attorney's phone during the conference? The agent hesitated. The attorney had his phone in the room during the consultation. She looked at the conference room door. Was there monitoring on that consultation? Attorney-client privilege. We couldn't. I'm not asking if you monitored it. I'm asking if the attorney's outgoing calls were logged through the station's cell tower records for tonight. I'd need to check with the tech team. Do that. She turned away from the door. And get me Agent DeLuca. She went to the records room and called Harmon on the radio. He was still at the hospital with Foss. The transport had gone smoothly. Foss was being evaluated. The agent was in the room. Foss had asked for paper and a pen and was writing something, which the agent was not stopping him from doing because it was not clear whether to stop him would be to their advantage or not. Nora told Harmon to let him write. Whatever Foss was committing to paper on his own initiative, without prompting and without an attorney present, was voluntary. And voluntary documentation from a cooperating witness was worth considerably more than the same information extracted through formal interview process. Agent DeLuca arrived at the records room door. Mid-30s, compact, with the focused quiet of someone who was very good at field work and knew it without needing to say so. I need everything the tech team has on outgoing communications from this building tonight, Nora said. Cell tower pings, station landline logs, anything routed through the building's network. I'm looking for a call made from a non-official device within the last 4 hours. Timeline? Start at 8. Work backward if you need to. How quickly? Now. DeLuca left. Nora sat at the records table and pulled the Foss financial disclosure page toward her and stared at it without reading it, because she was thinking about Carl Weber and what the next 12 hours had to look like, and the thinking required a surface to look at. The problem with Weber, if Weber was the problem, and she was not yet ready to commit that to certainty, because certainty before evidence was how cases fell apart, was that he existed inside the Bureau's own infrastructure. He had access credentials. He had standing relationships with multiple district offices. He had the kind of institutional knowledge that made him capable of doing significant damage to an active investigation, not through dramatic action, but through the quieter violence of redirected resources, misfiled reports, scheduling conflicts that appeared administrative, communication delays that seemed technical. The field investigation into Garrett County had been buried twice before it reached her desk. She had not, until tonight, thought carefully enough about how. She thought about it now. The first burial had happened 14 months ago, approximately the same time as the Foss letter. a field investigator had submitted a preliminary report on Garrett County's forfeiture practices that had been routed to the Wyoming District Office for regional context before being elevated. The preliminary report had never been elevated. It had been returned to the field investigator with a notation that the regional office required additional documentation before proceeding, documentation that had been specified in terms vague enough that the investigator had spent 3 months trying to satisfy a standard that moved every time she approached it. Eventually, she had been reassigned. The second attempt had made it to the assistant director level before a communication from the Wyoming district liaison had raised concerns about the investigative methodology and suggested a formal review of the field investigator's source material. The review had taken 2 months and had concluded inconclusively, which in practice meant the investigation stalled while the review was pending and then lost momentum when the review produced no actionable findings. Both interventions had originated from or been amplified through the Wyoming District Liaison's office. She had not seen that pattern until tonight because she had not been looking at the liaison's office. There was no particular reason to look at the liaison's office. It was infrastructure. It was the machinery through which things moved, not the thing that moved. That was how it worked when it worked. The corruption that survived longest was the corruption that made itself part of the system's connective tissue, the part that looked like process rather than interference, that looked like procedure rather than obstruction. DeLuca was back in 22 minutes. He set a printed log on the table without preamble. One outgoing call on an unregistered prepaid device, 8:47, duration 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The device pinged the county cell tower. We can't get the destination number without a carrier subpoena, but the call originated from inside this building. Narrowed to which part of the building? The signal strength puts it within 50 feet of the northwest corner. She looked at the station layout in her head. Northwest corner, the conference room where Tolliver had been all day. And directly adjacent to it, the small office where the attorney had been working between consultation sessions. The attorney made a call, she said, 4 minutes and 11 seconds, to a prepaid. Prepaid receiving end means someone had a burner. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Who carries a burner phone in a town the size of Cutter's Creek at 10 o'clock at night? DeLuca said nothing because it wasn't a question that needed answering. File the carrier subpoena first thing tomorrow, she said. Mark it priority and route it directly to me, not through the district office. He caught the emphasis on the last part. His expression didn't change, but she saw the adjustment in his eyes, the intake of a piece of information that changed the operating parameters. Understood, he said. And DeLuca, this conversation doesn't go into the shared case file yet. Personal notes only, encrypted, flagged for my eyes. You understand why? Yes, ma'am, he said. He did. She worked until 2 in the morning, at which point Harmon returned from the hospital and sat across from her at the records table, and they went through everything together, the way they had gone through things together for 12 years. Not performing it for each other, not building to conclusions, just laying out what they had and letting it be what it was. What it was. Tolliver, 11 years of documented misconduct, financial crimes, civil rights violations, 1 count of assaulting a federal officer for the wrist. Gerald Foss, compromised, cooperating, and alive. Neil Harwick, county attorney, calling from an unregistered number and requesting a quiet conversation. An attorney making a 4-minute call to a prepaid device from inside the station. Patricia Sundell's 9 years of handwritten dates and names. Darlene Okafor's stolen van and her 6 employees. Marcus Raines and 2 years of watching and saying nothing. And then, on a Tuesday, not saying nothing. And Carl Weber, whose name had not appeared in any document they had retrieved from Garrett County, and who existed in this picture only because a bleeding man sitting on a roadside with a broken wrist had said state-level official and tried to kill the investigation twice, and the arithmetic of those 2 facts, laid against the known history of the case, pointed somewhere that made Nora Valdez sit very still. How do you want to handle Weber? Harmon asked. Carefully, she said. We don't move on him until we have something he can't explain away. Right now we have Foss's verbal statement made in shock conditions, and whatever Foss wrote down on that paper at the hospital, which we haven't seen, that's not enough. The carrier subpoena on the prepaid could link the attorney's call to a number. Could. If the number connects to Weber, that's a data point. 1 data point isn't a case. What does a case look like? She thought about it. Financial records showing transfers from the Garrett County accounts to a state-level recipient. Communication logs showing contact between Weber and the liaison structure here during the periods when the investigation was redirected. And someone with direct knowledge who will say it in a room, on record, with a federal prosecutor present. Foss. Foss is the most likely, which is why he needs protection tonight and tomorrow, and for as long as this takes. She looked at the table. The attorney who made the call tonight was telling someone that Foss talked, and whoever received that call is now calculating what Foss's cooperation costs them. Harmon was quiet for a moment. You think Foss was run off the road because someone knew he was going to come to us? I think Foss was run off the road because someone panicked, she said. Panic is when these things get made. It's also when they get violent. She looked at him. Dale Pritchard, the name Foss gave us. We have a current address from the county vehicle registry. He's got a property record, 2 prior arrests in the county, both dismissed, which is interesting, and a vehicle registered in his name that matches the partial plate the perimeter agent logged. Bring him in tomorrow, early, before he's heard anything about tonight's operation through whatever grapevine exists in this county. First light, Harmon said. She nodded. And Paul, when you coordinate the Pritchard pickup, don't route it through the district liaison's office. Use direct field channels only. Document why. He looked at her across the table and understood everything that wasn't being said. This is going to be complicated, he said. It already is, she said. Get some sleep. She didn't take her own advice. She stayed in the records room until 4, reading through the physical files the records team had boxed and cataloged, looking for anything that bore on Weber or on the state-level conduit Foss had described. At 4:15, she found something in a folder that had been misfiled under a property dispute label. A series of printed email exchanges between Tolliver and an address she didn't recognize, spanning 18 months, discussing in careful and indirect language the status of various investigations and the expected timelines for their resolution. The email address was a personal account. The name associated with it, buried in the header metadata the IT forensics team had extracted but not yet flagged, was a first initial and a last name, C. Weber. She looked at it for a long time. Then she photographed it with her personal phone, encrypted the file, and sent it to a secure server that had nothing to do with the Wyoming district infrastructure. She slept 3 hours on the cot that someone had set up in the back office, which was the kind of sleep that covered the surface of the night without going deep, the kind she had learned to take when she had to and not complain about when she woke up. At 7, she was at the records table again with coffee and the morning light coming gray through the station's front windows. Patricia Sundell arrived at 7:40 with the notebook. It was a standard composition notebook, black and white cover, the kind sold at any drugstore for $2. She set it on the conference table in front of Nora with both hands, the way a person sets down something they have been carrying carefully for a long time. It was held closed by a rubber band that had been replaced at some point. The band was new. The groove it sat in was old. Nora removed the rubber band and opened it. The first entry was dated 9 years and 3 months ago. The handwriting was small and regular, the kind developed by someone who had learned early that space was limited and should not be wasted. Each entry contained a date, a name or names, a brief factual description of what had been witnessed, and in some cases a note about outcome. The outcomes, almost without exception, were variations of the same word: nothing, nothing filed, nothing recorded, nothing done. She turned pages slowly, names she recognized from the field reports, names she didn't, dollar amounts, dates. The systematic patient record of a woman who had sat at a front desk for 9 years and watched and written it down and said nothing publicly and kept the notebook under what she had said she kept at home, not at the station where it could be found, at home where it was hers. This is admissible, Nora said. You understand that? A personal contemporaneous record kept consistently over this period of time. This is evidence. Patricia Sundell, sitting across the table in her coat with her hands folded, nodded once. I know what it is, she said. I'm a retired paralegal. I worked in Cheyenne for 12 years before I moved out here. Nora looked at her. I knew what I was doing, Patricia said. I knew it the whole time. I also knew what happened to people who went against him in this county without something real. And this, she looked at the notebook, takes 9 years to become something real. So I waited. The morning proceeded with the specific momentum of an operation that has moved past its crisis point and entered the phase of execution. Harmon's team picked up Dale Pritchard at 6:48 from his property on the county's west edge. He was in his barn when they arrived, which suggested he had been moving equipment since before dawn, which suggested he'd had a long night. His truck was in the barn. The front grille had fresh damage consistent with a sideswipe impact, and there was a fragment of blue paint in the right headlight assembly that the forensics agent on scene photographed before Pritchard was formally advised of his rights. Pritchard asked for an attorney within 30 seconds of being read those rights, which was the correct legal move and also the move of someone who understood immediately how bad his situation was. He said nothing else. He was transported to the station. At 9:15, Neil Harwick walked through the front door of the Garrett County Sheriff's Station and asked for Director Valdez. He was wearing a suit that looked like it had been slept in, or more precisely, like it had been put on by someone who had not slept and was aware of the fact. He had an attorney with him, a woman, mid-50s, the composed and slightly detached manner of a defense attorney who had been called at an inconvenient hour and had come anyway because the retainer was significant. Met him in the conference room. Harwick looked around the room as he sat down, at the federal insignia on the materials stacked at the end of the table, at the agent posted by the door, at the changes to a space he had presumably sat in many times in a professional capacity. He looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived at a place he had been building toward for years and found it exactly as difficult as he had imagined. "You came in," she said. "I said I would." "You also said you wanted it managed." He glanced at his attorney. The attorney gave him the small nod that attorneys give when they've already discussed what can and cannot be said. "What I said last night was imprecise," he said. "What I mean is that I've been in a position that I handled badly for a long time, and I'm aware of how that looks, and I'm here because I'd rather tell you what I know than have you find it out without me." "That's a reasonable position," Nora said. "It's also the right one, legally speaking." She folded her hands on the table. "Before we go further, I want to confirm something Gerald Foss told me last night. He described a state-level official who had been involved in redirecting federal investigative resources away from this county for approximately 2 years. He described that official as receiving a portion of the forfeiture proceeds. He said there were 3 recipients total, himself included. She looked at Harwick steadily. "Who is the third person?" The attorney put her hand on Harwick's arm. He looked at her hand, then at Nora. "The third person," he said, "is not someone I've met in person. I know about them because Tolliver told me. He used them as leverage, as proof that the arrangement was protected at a level where it couldn't be reached. Tolliver told you there was a state-level official protecting the arrangement. 2 years ago, when He stopped, started again. "When I tried to stop participating, he told me it didn't matter what I wanted, that the people involved were too embedded to be moved, and that my options were to continue or to explain to a federal investigator why I had been co-signing forfeiture authorizations for 6 years. The room was very quiet. "He used your own participation to keep you inside," Nora said. "Yes." "And you stayed?" "Yes." The word landed flat, and he didn't soften it. He had the look of a man who had already had the conversation with himself where he tried to soften it and had found that it didn't soften. "The name," she said. "The state-level official. Did Tolliver ever name them?" Harwick looked at the table, then at her. Then he said a name that made the agent by the door shift his weight almost imperceptibly, and that made Nora's hands stay exactly where they were and her face stay exactly what it was, which took more effort than it should have. It was not Carl Weber. Weber's name in the email headers she had photographed and sent to a secure server at 4 in the morning, belonged to a man who handled scheduling and logistics. What Harwick had just said was the name of someone who did not handle logistics. Someone whose position gave them oversight of district operations across 3 states. Someone who had been in that position for 4 years. Someone who had been on the distribution list, she realized, not for the inspection tour routing, but for the preliminary case assessment that had first identified Garrett County as a target. The assessment that had been buried 14 months ago. The assessment that, unlike the tour routing, had been distributed at a level where that name would have appeared on the circulation list as a matter of standard practice. She kept her expression neutral. She thanked Harwick for coming in. She arranged for his formal recorded statement to begin in 1 hour, told his attorney the process, and walked out of the conference room. She went to the back parking lot. She called a number she had not called since taking this position, a number that existed for the specific purpose of the situation she was now in, a number that went to an office that operated independently of the institutional infrastructure that had just become compromised. It rang once. "Office of the Inspector General," said the voice on the other end. "This is Director Valdez," she said. "I need to report a potential compromise at the senior executive level. I have 2 witnesses and documentary evidence." She looked at the hills above the valley, dry and brown in the morning light. "And I need you to keep this channel clean, because the person I'm reporting has access to our standard communication infrastructure." A pause. Then, "Director, we'll need a secure location for this debrief." "I'm in Cutters Creek, Wyoming," she said. "I'm going to need you to come to me." "Understood. 6 hours." She ended the call and stood in the parking lot and thought about a man who had sat across from her in a briefing room 8 months ago and shaken her hand and said he was glad the Garrett County situation was being escalated because cases like that gave the Bureau a bad name if they went too long without resolution. He had said that. She could hear it exactly. She stood there long enough that the cold came through her scrubs, and she started to shiver slightly, and she didn't go inside. Because Marcus Raines had just come out the back door of the station, and his face had the particular look of someone carrying news they had not expected and did not know how to hold. "Director," he said. "What?" "Tolliver's attorney just filed a motion in the county court." He held out a printed page. He must have printed it the moment it came through. "Emergency motion. He's claiming that the federal warrants were improperly authorized and requesting an immediate suspension of the evidence collection." She took the page, read it in 15 seconds. The motion was filed by the attorney. But the legal language, the specific procedural argument, the citation pattern, the structure of the claim, was not the work of a private defense attorney working on short notice in rural Wyoming. She had seen this argument before. She had seen this exact argument before, in a different case, in a different state, 3 years ago. She knew where it had come from the first time. She knew who had drafted it. The motion was the same argument. The citation pattern was identical. Word for word in 3 of the key paragraphs, which was either a remarkable coincidence or evidence that the attorney in Cutters Creek had received a template, and the template had come from someone who had used it before, and the person who had used it before was the same person whose name Neil Harwick had said 20 minutes ago in the conference room. She looked at the motion, then at Raines. "Get me Harmon," she said. "Tell him it's now." Harmon was at the back door inside 90 seconds, which meant Raines had run. She handed him the motion without preamble. He read it standing in the cold, his breath visible in the morning air, and she watched his eyes move through the paragraphs and stop in the same place hers had stopped. "The citation pattern," he said. "You recognize it." "The Branford case. 3 years ago. The district liaison filed an amicus brief using this exact framework to challenge the evidentiary chain." He lowered the page. "The liaison at the time was the same name Harwick gave me 20 minutes ago," she said. "Yes." Harmon looked at the paper, then at her. "He's been doing this a long time." "Since before Garrett County," she said. "Garrett County is the one we found. It's probably not the only one." She took the motion back from him and folded it once. "The Inspector General's office is 6 hours out. Until they arrive, I need this operation to continue exactly as it was running before this motion was filed. Evidence collection doesn't stop. Interviews don't stop. We operate on the assumption that the motion will be challenged and overturned because it will be. The warrant language is solid, and he knows it, which means the motion isn't designed to win. It's designed to create delay and confusion and to give someone enough time to do something I don't want them to have time to do." "Destroy records," Harmon said. "Or leave," she said. He understood that immediately. "I'll get the field office in Cheyenne to flag outgoing travel. If he moves, I want to know within the hour. And Paul, root it clean, nothing through the district office." He went. She went back inside. The morning had the quality of a machine that had been running all night and was now entering its most critical operational phase, the phase where fatigue and accumulated pressure met the moment that required the clearest thinking. She had slept 3 hours. Her wrist had gone from red to purple and had stiffened in the cold. She drank coffee that had been sitting too long and tasted like it, and she stood at the records table and worked. Neil Harwick's formal statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. He was thorough in the way of someone who had decided that incomplete cooperation was worse than none, who had done the math and understood that the only version of his future that contained anything worth having required him to be the most useful person in the room. He named names, dates, amounts, and described in specific procedural detail how the forfeiture revenue had been moved, not through the county accounts directly, which would have been too visible, but through a series of vendor payments to contractors who did not exist, whose invoices had been approved by the county attorney's office, whose payments had then been distributed through private accounts. His own account had received, over 6 years, a total of $212,000. He said the number without flinching and without minimizing it. He said it the way a person says a true thing they are not proud of, which is to say plainly, without decoration, looking at the table. When the statement was complete and the recording had been stopped and his attorney had reviewed the documentation he had signed, Nora sat across from him in the silence that followed and said nothing for a moment. "You know this isn't over for you," she said. "Cooperation matters. It doesn't erase." "I know," he said. "The people who lost money, lost businesses, lost time and work and stability because of what this arrangement did to them. That's real, and it stays real, regardless of what you tell me." "I know that too." He looked at his hands on the table. They were the hands of a man who had spent 15 years doing paperwork and had recently realized that paperwork could be a weapon. "I told myself for a long time that I wasn't the one doing it, that Tolliver was doing it, and I was just processing the paperwork. I know that's not how it works. I knew it then." He paused. "I just didn't want to know it enough to do anything about it." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the most honest thing you've said in 3 hours," she said. "And you've said a lot of honest things." He nodded. He looked exhausted and scraped clean, the look of someone who has been carrying something dense for years and has just put it down and discovered that their legs are uncertain without the weight. She left him with his attorney and the processing agent and went to find Raines. He was at the front desk, where he had been since the previous morning in one capacity or another, and he looked like someone who had run on coffee and purpose and was starting to feel the edge of what that combination could sustain. She sat in the chair across from the desk, the civilian chair, the one meant for people coming in to report something, and looked at him. "When this is over," she said, "this department is going to be rebuilt. Federal oversight for a period, new command structure, new accountability framework. There will be positions that need to be filled by people who know this county." He was quiet for a second. "Are you offering me something?" "I'm telling you what the situation is going to look like," she said. "What you do with that information is your decision." He looked at the desk, at the badge on his chest, at whatever he was looking at when he looked at things without focusing on them. "I should have done something 2 years ago," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He looked up, apparently having expected something more forgiving. "You also drove me to the station and brought me coffee and left the door open," she said. "People are complicated. What matters now is what you do from here." He nodded slowly. It wasn't absolution, and she wasn't offering it, and he seemed to understand that the not offering was actually a form of respect. The Inspector General's team arrived at 1:17 in the afternoon. Not 6 hours, as promised, but closer to 4, which told her they had been moving faster than the estimate. 4 people, 2 of whom she knew by name, and 1 of whom she had worked a case with in a previous life when she was still a field agent, and the world was a smaller and more manageable place. The senior IG investigator's name was Sylvia Odom. She was a decade older than Nora, wore her silver hair short, and had the specific quality of a person who had spent their career investigating the people responsible for investigating everyone else, which had produced in her a skepticism so comprehensive it had become its own kind of clarity. She sat across from Nora in the records room and listened to the whole thing in one session. No interruptions, no questions until the end, just listening with the focused attention of someone who was building a 3-dimensional model in their head from the information being provided. When Nora finished, Odom sat quietly for a moment. "The motion filed this morning," she said. "That's the trigger." "It's the documentation that links the legal strategy to a specific source," Nora said. "Combined with Harwick's statement and the email metadata, it creates a chain. It's a short chain." "It's a starting chain," Nora said. "You'll build the rest." Odom looked at the evidence boxes stacked along the wall. "He's been in that position for 4 years. Yes. And you've interacted with him in that time." Twice, professionally. He was competent and unremarkable in both interactions, which in retrospect is either coincidence or deliberate management. Probably the latter, Odom said. The ones who last do it by being boring. She picked up her pen. I'm going to need everything you have on the email metadata before I move. The moment I contact his office, he'll know. The files are on a secured server outside standard district infrastructure. Nora pushed a handwritten access code across the table. Everything I photographed last night, plus the forensic extracts from the station's hard drives. Odom looked at the code. You routed around the district office. Starting last night, yes. Odom made a sound that was not quite approval but was adjacent to it. Good instinct. It wasn't instinct, Nora said. It was arithmetic. She left Odom to work and went outside. The afternoon had arrived warm by Wyoming October standards. Not warm by any absolute measure, but the sun was full and the wind had dropped, and the valley that had looked gray and closed in the early morning now showed what it actually was, which was wide and austere, and in its own way beautiful, the kind of landscape that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. She stood in the parking lot in her green scrubs, which she had been wearing for 36 hours, and she called the operations coordinator back in Washington. I need a logistics update, she said, and I need to ask you something directly. Of course, Director. Who in the operations office had access to the inspection tour routing before I left Cheyenne? A pause. Then the coordinator, who was a careful and methodical person, ran through the list. It matched what she already had. Operations staff, Harmon's assistant, transport, and the Wyoming district liaison. One addition, the coordinator said. There was a senior executive briefing on the regional inspection schedule 2 weeks before your departure. Standard quarterly update. The full routing was included in the briefing materials. Who received that briefing? The coordinator gave her the list. The name she was looking for was on it. She ended the call and stood in the sun and felt the weight of the last 36 hours settle into the specific places in her body where weight went when she wasn't paying attention to it. Her lower back, the base of her neck, the bruised wrist that had stiffened through the night and the morning and was now reminding her, with consistent and unambiguous pressure, that she was 51 and had slept 3 hours on a cot in a county sheriff's station. At 3 in the afternoon, Sylvia Odom made the call. She made it from the records room with the door closed, and Nora was not in the room because this part was the Inspector General's operation and not hers, and the disciplines of institutional process existed for reasons that did not evaporate because she found them inconvenient. She was in the hallway. She could hear nothing through the door. She drank coffee and looked at the notices on the hallway bulletin board. Most of them county administrative, a few FBI operational, one handwritten note from a deputy requesting that whoever was using the break room coffee pot clean it afterward, which had been there long enough to accumulate a curling edge. Harmon found her there 20 minutes later. His expression told her before he spoke. He tried to leave, he said. When? 2 hours ago. Cheyenne Field Office flagged a booking on a flight to Denver under a secondary name. Not his legal name, but a name cross-referenced to a passport issued under his security clearance authorization. He paused. Cheyenne put 2 agents at the gate. He didn't board. Where is he now? His office. The IG team is moving on him in the next 30 minutes. She nodded, looked at the bulletin board, looked at the coffee pot notice with its curling edge. He had a secondary travel identity authorized under his security clearance, she said. That means he built an exit before he needed one. People like that usually do, Harmon said. People like that, she said, are usually not caught until they use it. He didn't get to use it. No, she said. He didn't. The arrest happened at 4:03 in the afternoon in an office on the 4th floor of a federal building 400 miles away by agents who were not hers and whom she had never met, in a process she was not part of and would receive only a written summary of. That was how it was supposed to work. The director of the FBI did not arrest people. She built the case that made the arrest possible, and then she went home and slept. She was not going to be able to do that tonight. What she did instead was sit with Sylvia Odom in the records room for another 2 hours and go through the documented chain, piece by piece, making sure that every link was solid and every gap was noted and every piece of evidence that needed to be on the right shelf was on the right shelf. It was painstaking and unglamorous and necessary, the way most of the actual work of this profession was painstaking and unglamorous and necessary, and she had long ago made peace with the gap between what this work looked like from the outside and what it actually was. At 6 o'clock, she walked down to the conference room where Mick Tolliver had been for most of the past day, and she went inside and she sat across from him. His attorney was present. Tolliver himself had moved through several phases over the preceding 30 hours. The controlled anger of the morning, the calculation of the afternoon, something that had gradually resolved as the day wore on and the evidence mounted and the attorney's motions failed and the people around him continued to talk, into a flat and resigned stillness. He looked at her across the table the way people look at the thing that has ended them when they have accepted that it has ended them and are no longer spending energy on the alternative. "You knew who I was," she said, "before you put the handcuffs on me." He said nothing. "You got a phone call in the parking lot before you came inside. You looked around the diner until you found me. You knew what I looked like, and you knew I was there, and you made a choice." Still nothing. "I want to understand the choice," she said, "because there were other options. You could have done nothing. You could have let me eat my eggs and drive out of this county and dealt with whatever the investigation produced through whatever channels you had available. You chose to put handcuffs on a federal director in a public diner in front of a room full of people." Tolliver looked at the table. His jaw moved once. Then he said, without looking up, "He told me you were coming to take the operation apart, that if you got what you needed, you'd bring the whole thing down." He paused. "He said if I gave you a reason to be here officially, detained, it would create a procedural problem for the warrants, that it would buy time. He told you to arrest me. He said it would slow things down. And you trusted that." Tolliver looked up. For the first time since the previous morning, something in his face was not controlled. Not anger, not calculation, but something rawer and less managed. The look of a man who has realized that the person he trusted to protect him had used him as a disposable piece. "I trusted him for 11 years, he said. "I did everything he said." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Darlene Okafor's van, paid off over 4 years, wrapped with the company name, Professional. She thought about Patricia Sundell's notebook, 9 years of dates and names that nobody had asked for, and she had kept anyway. She thought about Marcus Rain standing in a parking lot 2 years ago, watching money come out of a wallet, and going home and sitting in his truck. "You did everything he said," she said, "and the people in this county absorbed all of it." She stood up. "I hope you understand," she said, "that the people who gave you the most trouble weren't the ones who had power. They were the ones who didn't. The ones who filed complaints that disappeared. The ones who showed up alone to ask where their van was." She straightened the folder under her arm. "Those are the people who were here the whole time. You just couldn't see them." She left the conference room. She did not look back. The days that followed moved in the way that consequential things move when the crisis has passed and the machinery of accountability has taken over. Not fast, not cinematic, not the way the preceding 48 hours had moved, but steadily, with the particular grinding permanence of a process that has enough evidence to be inevitable. The federal charges were filed on a Thursday, 3 days after the arrest at the station. Tolliver faced 11 counts, including civil rights violations, financial crimes, obstruction, and assault of a federal officer. Gerald Foss faced 4 counts and had entered a cooperation agreement that his attorney and the federal prosecutor spent 2 weeks negotiating in a process that was, by all accounts, difficult. Neil Harwick faced 3 counts and had already been providing material assistance. Dale Pritchard was charged separately with attempted vehicular assault and 2 counts related to the Foss incident, with additional charges pending forensic analysis of the truck. The senior official, the man whose name Harwick had said in the conference room, whose arrest had happened 400 miles away while Nora stood in a hallway reading a coffee pot notice, faced 8 federal charges including corruption, obstruction of justice, misuse of federal resources, and conspiracy. His attorney entered a not guilty plea and announced an aggressive defense strategy that legal analysts described as unlikely to succeed given the documentary evidence. Patricia Sundell's notebook became, as Nora had told her it would, a significant piece of evidence. It was authenticated through handwriting analysis and cross-referenced against 7 years of station records, and its admissibility was challenged twice and upheld twice. And in the end, it covered the evidentiary gaps in 16 separate incidents that otherwise would have been difficult to document. Darlene Okafor testified in the federal proceeding in a way that the prosecutor later described privately as devastating in its clarity and composure. She sat in the witness chair and described what had happened to her business and her employees with the precise, unembellished factual specificity of someone who had been waiting 2 years to say it in a room where it counted. And she said it without performance, without the kind of visible emotion that defense attorneys tried to characterize as unreliability, and she was believed. Her van was never recovered. It had been sold through an informal arrangement to a buyer in another state and was not traceable. The federal restitution order would cover its assessed value plus the 18 months of lost business revenue, an amount that would not give her back the 5 years she had spent building the business, or the 2 employees who had moved away and not come back, or the particular grief of watching something you built get taken apart by someone who had done it before and expected to do it again. But it was something. It was not nothing. Marcus Raines was formally cleared of involvement in the department's misconduct after a 3-week review process that examined his conduct record in detail. The review found no evidence of active participation, and his cooperation with the federal investigation was noted. He applied for the interim deputy sheriff position created when the county's law enforcement structure was reorganized under federal oversight, and he got it. And he spent the first week in the job sitting behind a desk that had been Tolliver's desk and not quite being able to look at it without thinking about the 2 years he had spent coming into the same room and doing nothing. He decided the best thing to do with that feeling was to keep it, because a version of Marcus Raines that had forgotten what it felt like to do. Nothing was a version that was more likely to do nothing again. Bev, the waitress at Harlan's Diner, became briefly well known in the county as the person who had served the FBI director scrambled eggs on the morning everything changed. She found this more amusing than anything else. She had worked in the diner for 14 years, and in her experience, people revealed themselves most clearly in how they treated people they believed could not affect them, and the woman in the green scrubs had been polite and left a $12 tip on a $9 meal, and the sheriff had been what he always was, and the rest had followed naturally from that. She told this to a local reporter who wrote a short piece about the diner's role in the case. The piece ran in the county paper and was picked up by 2 state outlets and 1 national publication, which sent a journalist to interview Bev, who made the journalist coffee and answered questions for 40 minutes and said, at the end, that she hoped people took from it something simple, that how you treat someone when you think they're powerless is exactly who you are. Nora Valdez returned to Washington on a Friday afternoon, flying out of Casper on a commercial flight, carrying the same manila folder she had been reading at the diner 6 days before. The folder was now considerably thicker, supplemented with notes and cross-references, and the handwritten contact list she had compiled during the operation, but it was the same folder. She had a bruise on her wrist that had gone through several colors and was now in its final yellowish phase, the phase that preceded disappearing. She wore it without covering it in the days following the operation, not as a statement, but because she didn't think about it until people asked. And when people asked, she told them what it was, which was evidence of what happened when someone believed they could touch a person without consequence because that person looked like someone without power. She sat in her office the Monday after she returned and read through the IG's preliminary findings, which were dense and procedural and confirmed what she had already known while also expanding the scope considerably. The senior official's activities had touched not just the Garrett County case, but 2 prior investigations in other states, and the full accounting was going to take months to establish, and longer than that to prosecute. She read it through twice, and then set it aside and looked at the window, which faced a building across the street that was very similar to the building she was in, and she thought about the valley. She thought about the specific light in the late afternoon there, and the hawks over the ridge, and the way the town had looked from the back of the cruiser on the 3-minute drive to the station, the hardware store, the pharmacy, the community board with its unreadable flyers, the particular smallness of it, and the particular damage that had been done inside that smallness, in the spaces between the buildings, in the offices and diners and parking lots where the people who lived there had learned to make themselves inconspicuous. She thought about Patricia Sundell deciding 9 years ago to write things down. Not because she knew it would matter, not because she had a plan, but because doing nothing with the things she saw felt like a kind of participation she couldn't sustain, and writing them down was the only other thing available to her. That was the part that stayed with Nora. Not the arrests, not the motions, not the chain of connections that had ultimately led 400 miles away to a man trying to board a plane under a secondary name. Those were the mechanisms. The mechanisms worked or they didn't, depending on 100 variables that no one person controlled. What stayed with her was the notebook. The composition notebook with the new rubber band and the old groove, 9 years of a woman sitting at a front desk and writing down what she saw in the only space she had, on her own time, for an audience of nobody, because someone had to remember. That was not nothing. That was in fact the thing that everything else depended on. The official apparatus, the warrants, the tactical teams, the forensic accountants, the IG investigators, that apparatus required a door to come through, and the door existed because people like Patricia Sundell and Darlene Okafor and Marcus Raines had held it open from the inside, at cost, often without knowing whether anyone was ever going to walk through it. Power worked like that. Real power, not the kind Mick Tolliver had, which was the power of a man with a badge in a room where no one could challenge him, which was not power so much as the temporary advantage of an unchecked position, but the kind that changed things, the kind that lasted. That kind was usually held by people who looked, from the outside, like they didn't have any. The woman in the scrubs eating eggs at the corner table, the waitress who poured coffee without being asked, the front desk employee who went home every night and wrote down what she saw. Nora had spent 26 years learning the formal mechanisms of accountability, the law, the evidence standards, the procedural frameworks that turned observed wrongdoing into documented fact and documented fact into consequence. Those mechanisms were real, and they mattered, and she believed in them with the specific belief of someone who had seen what happened in places where they didn't exist. But she had also spent 26 years learning that the mechanisms were only as good as the people who decided, in small private moments, to hold on to what they knew, to write it down, to call the number, to leave the door not quite closed, to stay at the desk 3 hours past the end of their shift because something was happening that they didn't want to walk away from. Those people were not heroes in the way the word usually got used. They were tired and imperfect, and most of them had waited longer than they should have and had complicated reasons for the waiting. They were not going to be in any briefing summary. Their names were not going to appear in the press accounts that described the case in terms of agencies and officials and judicial proceedings. But the case was theirs. The accountability that Mick Tolliver and Gerald Foss and Neil Harwick and a senior federal official were now facing, that belonged, in the way that things actually belong to the people who make them possible, to a woman with a composition notebook and a cleaning service owner who asked about her van and a young deputy who brought coffee to someone he had just helped put in a holding room. Nora picked up her pen and opened the next file. She had 14 active cases on her desk. 3 of them had the particular shape, the buried complaints, the redirected resources, the numbers that didn't quite add up in the right way, that Garrett County had had before anyone looked closely. She had been looking closely at things for 26 years, and she was not going to stop. She was not going to stop because the alternative was a world in which Darlene Okafor's van never got explained, and Patricia Sundell's notebook filled up and went into a drawer somewhere, and the people in the town at the bottom of the valley went on learning to make themselves small in the spaces between the buildings. She started reading. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary way, indifferent to the case in Wyoming, indifferent to the 14 cases on the desk, indifferent to the specific and unglamorous work of people who had decided that the gap between what the law promised and what it delivered was a gap worth spending a career trying to close. The city didn't need to care. The work didn't require its attention. It only required hers. And the bruise on her wrist faded day by day, the way bruises do. Not all at once, not cleanly, but gradually. The body healing itself in the order it chose, at the pace it set. Until one morning she looked at her wrist and the mark was gone, and the only evidence that any of it had happened was in the files and in the cases, and in a town in Wyoming that was quieter than it had been, and more honest, and still imperfect in all the ways that towns are imperfect, but different in the way that matters, the way that starts with someone deciding to stay in the room.